Right behind me is where an important event took place in 1856 that would forever change our nation's history and lead to the Civil War just 5 years later.
At the height of the 19th century, our nation was deeply divided over the fault line of slavery. Whether to allow this practice to continue or to stop its spread, that was the question. The participants of this debate were stratified into two camps, largely based upon their location, the South and the North. The South, with its agrarian economy, required slave labor to produce food, while the North, with its manufacturing-based economy, did not. The origins of this divide between the North and the South trace back to our nation's birth. At the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, the question of representation arose. There were many different sides, and a compromise was drawn up. Known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, it allowed states to count 3/5 of their slave populations as citizens, thus increasing the number of representatives they had in Congress. Since Southern states had large slave populations, this inflated the number of representatives they had. Northern states did not like this, and this disparity would be the seed for future conflicts. Additionally, throughout the North, the movement of abolitionism was growing. Abolitionists sought to outlaw and end slavery once and for all. These movements had existed during Revolutionary times, but picked up speed during the Second Great Awakening, a Christian revival movement. Abolitionism continued to expand well into the 19th century. There was also opposition from working-class members as they did not want to compete with slaves for jobs. As the century progressed, most northern states had enacted policies that allowed for the gradual emancipation of slaves, while the South had no such plans, thus escalating regional tensions and heightening the divide between the North and the South. At the time of the abolitionist movement, the United States was expanding, in part fueled by the ideal of manifest destiny. As new territories and eventually states were formed, organized, and admitted to the nation, the slave debate came into question. As people entered the new territories and settled, they also brought slavery with them. Most Northerners did not want slavery in these new areas because it would give the South a political advantage, force working-class members to compete with slaves for jobs, and slavery ran contrary to abolitionist goals. This led to the debate as to whether states should be free states with slavery outlawed or slave states where slavery was allowed. In 1854, the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska were opened to the nation. By the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the inhabitants of these territories would vote as to whether slavery would be allowed in these territories or not. As a result, hundreds of people arrived to these areas, simply to influence the vote. When pro-slavery settlers met anti-slavery settlers, violence broke out in what came to be known as Bleeding Kansas. Word quickly spread throughout the nation about Bleeding Kansas, and a senator from Massachusetts prepared a speech he would deliver to Congress about this topic. His name was Charles Sumner. On May 19, 1856, Sumner delivered a speech known as The Crime Against Kansas, The Apologies for the Crime, The True Remedy. He began at 1 p.m. with every word memorized. Over the course of 2 days, Sumner attacked the atrocities occurring in Kansas. It should be noted that most of the information he stated was false, since he stated what he had learned from biased accounts of anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. In particular, he attacked two senators, Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina and Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. He launched a personal insult against Andrew Butler with the famous phrase, "The senator from South Carolina has read many books of chivalry and believes himself a chivalrous knight with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, although ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Although polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery." Some people approved of what he said, but many were angry, especially a representative named Preston Brooks. Brooks was a nephew of Butler, and viewed Sumner's speech as an attack on his family honor. He thought of challenging Sumner to a duel, but felt that Sumner was below him, and so decided to beat him instead. On May 22, 1856, shortly after the Senate had adjourned for that day, Brooks went to Sumner, accompanied by Lawrence M. Keat, a representative of South Carolina, and Henry A. Edmondson, a representative from Virginia. Sumner was seated at his desk when Brooks approached him and said, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who was a relative of mine." With that brief sentence, Brooks proceeded to beat Sumner with his thick gutta-percha cane. Sumner began bleeding profusely and lost consciousness. Several nearby congressmen tried to help Brooks, but Keat waved a pistol at them, shouting, "Let them be." Sumner tried to get up, but knocked the table he was working at, which was originally bolted to the floor and was pinned beneath it. Eventually, Two senators from New York took Sumner away to the vice presidential chamber where he was treated. If it had not been for these two senators, Sumner would have died that day. The beating of Senator Sumner generated much publicity. In the North, many people were shocked at this incident and became convinced that violence was the only way that Southerners could respond to any issue. Here is an excerpt from an editorial that appeared in the Boston Atlas dated May 23, 1856. It reads, Honorable Charles Sumner, one of the senators of Massachusetts, was yesterday brutally assaulted by a ruffian named Brooks, who represents South Carolina in the lower house. Those who know Mr. Sumner will readily believe that nothing in his conduct or conversation could have provoked the outrage. By contrast, many people in the South believe that Brooks's actions were correct and justified. In fact, several people sent him canes as presents in case he ever needed more. Here is an excerpt from an editorial that appeared in the South Carolinian, dated May 27, 1856. It reads, We were not mistaken in asserting on Saturday last that the Honorable Preston S. Brooks had not only the approval but the hearty congratulations of the people of South Carolina for his summary chastisement of the abolitionist Sumner. Finally, it became obvious to most, if not all, Americans that the divide between the North and the South was deepening, and that the escalating tensions would soon metamorphosize from a warfall with words to a warfall with weapons. In fact, after this incident, many members of Congress arrived well armed, and weapons were often flashed during session. This incident in our nation's capital helped provide one of the many sparks that would generate the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history and challenge our nation's very core, the Civil War.
Looking back, we can see how 150 years ago, this simple event would generate the greatest test our nation would ever face and forever alter its history.